They had lived with the pressure for months, moving between briefings, maps, and rooms where clocks seemed louder than voices. The British High Command understood that the next major operation would not be incremental. It would be decisive in its ambition, enormous in its logistics, and unforgiving in its margin for error. Planning staffs were divided across war rooms and temporary offices, tracking convoys, tides, airfields, fuel stocks, and the slow accumulation of vessels along the coast. Every decision carried both operational and political implications, and yet the men around the tables were trained to translate uncertainty into a workable plan. They considered routes through the channel, studied beach gradients, rehearsed signals traffic, and adjusted timetables to the rhythm of weather systems moving across the Atlantic. Nothing about the coming operation felt abstract. Each line on the map represented soldiers, equipment, and consequences. Within this environment, the expectation of American participation was never treated as supplemental. It was central. British commanders had long understood that the war's strategic balance had shifted. To open a second front and sustain it, the United States would have to bring not only manpower but also the industrial depth that lay behind it. Conversations unfolded in measured tones about how U.S. formations would integrate with British command structures, how differences in doctrine would be reconciled, and how joint logistics would be synchronized without confusion. There was recognition that cooperation at this scale required a form of discipline that exceeded individual brilliance. It demanded procedures, clarity of roles, and trust built through repetition. The preparations grew increasingly technical. Staff officers calculated tonnage capacities of landing craft, the rate at which vehicles could be unloaded, and the number of sorties that Allied air forces would need to fly simply to keep pressure on German defenses. They estimated daily ammunition consumption, medical evacuation capacities, and the fuel necessary for the first week ashore. British commanders reviewed these figures not as abstractions, but as commitments that had to be honored. Each number carried risk. If they were wrong by even a modest percentage, movement would stall, and momentum, so critical in the opening phase, could vanish. Anticipating the American role meant more than acknowledging scale. It meant adapting to it. British officers evaluated headquarters structures to ensure communication lines would remain intelligible across national boundaries. Radios were standardized where possible. Liaison officers were positioned to translate language, procedure, and intent. Exercises along the British coastline rehearsed embarkation, loading priorities, and the complex choreography of mixing ships, units, and schedules. The British brought deep experience from earlier amphibious operations, but they also recognized that the Americans would bring energy, resources, and a willingness to commit forces on a scale rarely seen. Bridging those cultures required steady leadership. The atmosphere in planning rooms was not triumphant. It was measured and professional. Reports from intelligence services indicated German defenses strengthening along the coast, and every new bunker or gun position added weight to the calculations. British commanders discussed contingency options if weather closed in, if beach obstacles proved worse than anticipated, or if counterattacks arrived faster than expected. Against this background, the idea of a vast American invasion force assembling was both reassuring and sobering. Reassuring because success seemed impossible without it. Sobering because failure with such resources would be catastrophic. Quietly, The British reflected on what it meant to fight a war that had evolved from national survival into a coalition effort requiring unprecedented coordination. The presence of American divisions, aircraft, engineers, and naval power signaled that the next operation would be beyond anything Europe had witnessed in this conflict. Anticipation took the form of checklists, revisions, and late-night conversations over maps that never seemed complete. They were preparing not only to launch an invasion, but to create the conditions for sustaining it day after day, port by improvised port, mile by contested mile. In that preparation, the expectation of American involvement was not merely awaited. It was built into the very architecture of the plan, a structural element as essential as the tides they studied and the beaches they measured. They saw it first not as an abstract tally on a planning sheet, but as a physical horizon that would not end. From the cliffs and from command posts overlooking the embarkation zones, the British generals watched the American fleet gathering piece by piece, day after day, until it became something almost architectural. Rows of landing craft-filled harbors built to handle only a fraction of that traffic. Cargo ships lay at anchor in layered formations, their silhouettes overlapping like scaffolding. Tankers, transports, tugs, repair vessels, and escort ships crowded every navigable channel. What had been quiet coastal towns only months earlier were now logistical arteries pulsing with movement. Cranes worked without pause. Depot yards filled with pallets, crates, and vehicles waiting for assignment. The scale did not announce itself with noise or ceremony. It emerged through accumulation, as if weight had slowly attached itself to the sea. For commanders trained to read capacity, the fleet was not just impressive, it was measurable. They counted lines of vehicles staged along roads leading toward embarkation points, each with chalk markings, loading priorities, and timed movements. They noted embarkation tables showing precise intervals at which men and equipment would board. They saw barges lying low in the water under the mass of supplies, ammunition cases stacked to standardized heights, fuel drums secured in tight grids, bridging equipment lashed into place. Officers reported figures in tonnage rather than in adjectives. Each pier became a timetable. Each ship represented a calculated slice of combat power projected across the channel. Looking across this combined maritime assembly, the British understood that they were witnessing not merely transport, but an industrial system made mobile. The fleet's presence transformed the coastal environment. Roads became one-way corridors controlled by military police. Rail yards pushed rolling stock forward in scheduled waves. Temporary depots extended into fields, marked by camouflage nets and rows of numbered signs. American units operated with disciplined repetition, loading, unloading, testing, and rechecking manifests. British generals observed this with professional interest. They had fought long enough to know that battles are often decided not in moments of shock, but in the unseen mechanics that precede them. Here, the mechanics were undeniable. Ships waited in tiers, each assigned to specific beaches, specific units, specific hours. The precision required to align all of it under changing weather and strict secrecy gave the scene a quiet intensity that needed no rhetoric. There was also a human dimension that the fleet made unmistakable. Thousands of men moved through assembly areas wearing life belts and carrying equipment marked with embarkation codes. Chaplains spoke in tents near the docks. Medical teams rehearsed casualty handling on the piers. Signal units tested radios from ship to shore, plotting fallback channels in case of interference. The British commanders took in these details not sentimentally, but soberly. Every man represented a logistical chain stretching backward to factories, farms, and training grounds, and forward to beaches that were still only contour lines on a map. The fleet concentrated all of that effort into one visible manifestation, anchored just offshore. As daylight faded and navigation lights came on, the sheer density became even clearer. Points of light traced the shapes of hulls, extending outward into the dark like a second coastline. Patrol craft moved constantly among them, enforcing order, checking assignments, keeping lanes clear. The British generals recognized the vulnerability as well as the potential. So much power concentrated in one place invited disaster if discipline failed. Yet the behavior of the fleet was orderly, restrained, and methodical. Orders moved through liaison channels deliberately. Delays were recorded, adjusted, and absorbed into revised tables without panic. It was an operational culture built to manage friction rather than to ignore it. Standing there, they did not speak in grand phrases. Observations were concise, practical, and grounded in the arithmetic of what they were seeing. The American invasion fleet was no longer a projection on a planning board. It was present, measured in hulls, decks, and cargo holds. It suggested momentum that, once released, would be difficult to stop or reverse. And in that first moment when its full reach became visible across the water, the British generals grasped that the coming operation would unfold on a scale that demanded constant discipline from the first minute onward, because the cost of any miscalculation had now grown visibly, tangibly larger. For the British generals, the first reaction was not loud. It was a pause, the brief silence of professionals recalculating. What lay before them did not resemble the conventional fleets they had studied earlier in the war. This was mass arranged with purpose, an accumulation so extensive that instinctively they began converting visual impressions into figures. Displacement tonnage, lift capacity, fuel consumption per day. They estimated how many divisions could be sustained, how many days of operations could be supported before resupply, how quickly the system could recover from inevitable disruptions. Surprise, when it appeared, was tempered by arithmetic. The magnitude exceeded expectations, yet the questions that followed were disciplined. Could the channels handle the traffic? Could the beaches process the flow? And could command systems keep pace with the volume they were now witnessing? Some voiced their thoughts quietly. One senior officer remarked that if a mistake occurred at this scale, it would not remain small. Another observed that the fleet resembled a floating port rather than a transient convoy. Their language shifted toward logistics immediately. They asked about sequencing, about the spacing of convoys, about the redundancy built into loading plans. They wanted to see how many spare landing craft existed if losses mounted quickly. They inspected manifests, cross-checking that ammunition, engineering stores, rations, and medical equipment were balanced rather than over-concentrated. Beneath the calm exterior, the surprise was real. The Americans had assembled a level of maritime lift that redefined what an amphibious operation could attempt. With surprise came calculation. The British generals understood that power at this level creates its own vulnerabilities. Density invites risk. They identified choke points in harbors, narrow turns along approach routes, and stretches of coastline where mines or air attack could multiply their effects. They counted escorts and anti-aircraft batteries, measured radar coverage, and reviewed procedures for dispersal if threats appeared suddenly. Even admiration carried a note of concern. The fleet looked invulnerable only from a distance. Up close, they saw seams that would require discipline to hold together. Their planning instincts sharpened. Contingencies were not theoretical, they became immediate requirements. A few expressed concern about tempo. Could the coordination of embarkation schedules and tidal windows sustain reliability over consecutive days? Could communications handle the pressure of thousands of simultaneous movements without confusion? They knew from earlier operations that friction accumulates quietly, a delayed truck column, a broken winch, a damaged pier. Multiplied across this fleet, those minor failures could cascade. Their reaction, therefore, was not doubt, but vigilance. They pressed their staffs for updated tables, for revised risk assessments, for proof that backup plans had genuine depth rather than optimistic assumptions. There was also a recognition of psychological weight. Seeing so much hardware concentrated in one place underscored the stakes in a way that paper never had. The presence of thousands of men aboard those ships represented decisions already made, commitments that could no longer be withdrawn without consequence. Some generals acknowledged privately that the scale imposed a moral gravity. They were responsible for guiding a force whose losses, if mismanaged, would be measured not in units but in communities. Concern in this sense was neither fear nor hesitation. It was a sober acceptance that every order would carry extended human and logistical implications. Even amid concern, their professional respect deepened. The system was coherent. Loading diagrams matched harbor movements. Signals discipline remained firm. American officers communicated with clarity, documenting deviations, correcting errors, and reinstating timelines. The British watched this and recognized an operational culture capable of absorbing shocks. Their reaction combined surprise at the magnitude with reassurance that procedures, not spectacle, govern the enterprise. In the measured conversations that followed, the tone remained restrained. No one indulged in rhetoric. They spoke instead of capacities, priorities, and tolerances, how much stress the system could bear and how quickly it could recover. As the day wore on and the fleet continued to organize, their reactions settled into a disciplined posture. The shock of scale gave way to analysis. Analysis gave way to careful monitoring. They did not allow admiration to obscure risk, nor concern to undermine confidence. What they saw demanded humility, the recognition that success would depend less on bold gestures than on the relentless management of a force so large that even small misjudgments could ripple outward. In that quiet recalibration, part surprise, part calculation, part concern, the British generals aligned themselves to the reality before them, aware that the sheer magnitude of forces would shape every decision from that point forward. As the initial shock subsided, the British generals began translating impression into judgment. The fleet was no longer merely large. It represented capability in layers. They examined what such mass could actually deliver ashore and sustain beyond the first violent hours. Numbers took on operational meaning. A fleet of this depth suggested that the invasion would not hinge on a single wave, but on continuous reinforcement measured in thousands of tons per day. They considered the cumulative effect. Artillery able to fire without rationing, engineering units equipped to clear obstacles and build temporary roads, medical facilities capable of absorbing casualties without paralysis. Where earlier amphibious efforts had often been constrained by scarcity, this armada projected the opposite, an intention to overwhelm logistical friction rather than merely endure it. Their assessments turned toward tempo. With this many ships, properly sequenced, tempo could become a weapon. They imagined the German defenders confronting not a solitary landing, but a succession of coordinated arrivals that never paused long enough to regain balance. Convoys, each with assigned priorities, could replace losses, reinforce breakthroughs, and prevent the beachhead from stagnating into a fragile perimeter. The British understood that momentum in assault operations rarely emerges from daring alone. It comes from the reliable arrival of the next echelon at the precise moment it is needed. Looking at the fleet, they saw the material basis for maintaining that rhythm, but they also recognized the conditional nature of success. The fleet offered potential, not certainty. Its promise rested on disciplined synchronization between sea, air, and land. British commanders assessed whether the command architecture could translate mass into coherence. They reviewed how quickly information would flow from beaches to naval control ships, how responsive loading plans were to battlefield change, and how authority would be exercised when plans collided with reality. The sheer scale demanded decision-making that was both centralized in intent and decentralized in execution. If that balance held, the Armada could become an instrument of sustained pressure. If it faltered, abundance might turn to congestion. They evaluated the psychological dimension with the same clinical care. A fleet of this magnitude projected inevitability. It signaled to friend and foe alike that the Allies were prepared to commit until resolution, not simply to probe. That message mattered. For troops embarking, the knowledge that reserves, supplies, and supporting arms extended far beyond the horizon steadied nerves. For German commanders, the sight, once revealed, would imply that any tactical success might prove temporary against such depth. The British did not describe this as morale. They framed it as confidence built on material assurance, a factor as real as armor thickness or the range of naval guns. The tension then shifted to endurance. Could the fleet maintain throughput once the first landings were complete and the battle became a contest of attrition? They examined replenishment systems, oilers positioned to keep escorts fueled, repair ships ready to return damaged craft to service, and convoy schedules that stretched not for days but for weeks. The presence of floating workshops, hospital ships, and specialized vessels designed to unload without ports suggested that planners expected friction and had already pre-invested in solutions. To the British generals, this indicated strategic seriousness, an understanding that victory ashore would depend on turning the channel into a functioning supply highway. At the same time, they assessed risk with unblinking realism. The larger the fleet, the greater the potential for systemic disruption if critical elements were struck. They evaluated dispersion measures, anti-submarine screens, and air cover density. They asked whether redundancy had been built deliberately into the design, excess lift capacity, spare communications nodes, alternate anchorage points. Their emerging conclusion was not that the invasion would be easy, but that the architecture allowed for damage without collapse. The system appeared resilient, capable of absorbing shocks while continuing to deliver combat power forward. Gradually, their reactions coalesced into a measured conviction. The fleet implied that the forthcoming operation would not rely on improvisation. It would be prosecuted with sustained weight, constantly reinforced, increasingly difficult to dislodge as each hour passed. Success, they judged, would come less from a single dramatic breakthrough than from the accumulation of capacity delivered relentlessly across the water. In that quiet assessment, the magnitude of the American fleet ceased to be simply a spectacle. It became evidence that the invasion, if managed with discipline, possessed the logistical foundation necessary to carry the fight inland and keep it there long after the first landings had faded from view. In the days that followed, the British generals found their thoughts turning increasingly toward the problem of cooperation. The fleet's size made it obvious that no single nation, no single headquarters, could hold all variables in hand. Success depended on relationships, naval officers aligning with Army priorities, air commanders timing strikes to the minute, liaison staffs translating intent across doctrine and culture. Around conference tables, the discussion grew quieter, not louder. They reviewed coordination matrices showing who reported to whom when authority shifted from naval control to ground command, and how disputes would be resolved under time pressure. They understood from hard experience that miscommunication did not merely waste effort. At this scale, it could cost entire phases of the operation. Cooperation, therefore, was treated as an asset to be engineered, rehearsed, and protected with the same seriousness as ammunition or fuel. Command pressure built alongside these reflections. Each general recognized that decisions would be made under imperfect information, compressed timelines, and visible consequences. The chain of command had to be clear, but not rigid. Orders would have to move with precision, yet remain adaptable when weather, enemy reaction, or sheer friction disrupted original plans. They studied decision thresholds. When to commit reserves, when to divert landing craft, when to shift bombardment targets to support a faltering sector. The presence of so many men and so much material intensified every calculation. A misjudged order could cascade across the entire front. The commanders felt that weight personally. It was not expressed in dramatic language. It appeared instead in meticulous questions, careful phrasing, and an insistence on verification before commitment. Risk analysis became a constant discipline. They listed vulnerabilities almost as a reflex. Minds concentrated along approach lanes. Submarine threats lurking beyond escort screens. Weather fronts that could ground aircraft while convoys continued to move, exposing ships without full air cover. Even the beaches themselves posed uncertainties, sand that might swallow vehicles, causeways too narrow for the volume of traffic, defensive positions concealed beyond aerial photography. They examined contingency plans with a clinical patience, asking not whether something might go wrong, but how the system would respond when it did. That distinction mattered. They were no longer trying to eliminate risk. They were shaping the operation so that risk could be absorbed without collapse. Cooperation, however, was not merely procedural. It carried strategic implications. The British understood that American willingness to commit so much force reflected trust in shared objectives. That trust had to be reciprocated through competence and honesty. Reports could not be softened to avoid embarrassment. Failures had to be acknowledged quickly so they could be corrected. British and American staffs would have to share intelligence, logistics data, and priorities with a level of transparency that wartime institutions did not always find comfortable. Yet the generals concluded that coalition warfare at this scale left no alternative. The enemy would exploit any seam. Therefore, seams had to be closed before battle began. The pressure of command also extended downward. Unit leaders would be asked to execute complex orders while navigating chaotic environments where landmarks vanished under smoke and tides changed the shape of the shoreline. The generals reflected on training, on the clarity of operational orders, and on the psychological endurance required to maintain discipline when plans frayed. They pushed for brevity in instructions, repetition in rehearsals, and realistic expectations about confusion on the day. Pressure, they believed, should not be denied or minimized. It should be anticipated, named, and distributed carefully so that no single echelon carried more than it could bear. Risk, cooperation, and command merged into a single strategic picture. If cooperation failed, risk multiplied. If command hesitated or overreached, the fleet's power could be squandered. If risk was ignored rather than managed, the first setback might trigger reaction instead of response. The British generals did not seek certainty, they sought resilience. They looked for signs that the plan could bend without breaking, that subordinates had the authority to improvise within intent, and that coalition partners were aligned not just in rhetoric but in practice. In these reflections there was no bravado. There was a sober recognition that the operation ahead demanded discipline equal to its ambition, a disciplined cooperation under relentless pressure, meeting risks that would arrive not all at once, but in steady, accumulating waves. Watching the fleet assemble altered the assumptions that had guided months of planning. The British generals had prepared for an operation defined by difficulty, attrition, and narrow margins. Yet as the full breadth of ships, men, and material filled the horizon, they began to understand that the coming assault would be judged not solely by whether it reached the shore, but by how decisively it could build beyond it. Expectations shifted from survival to sustained projection of power. They no longer spoke in terms of testing German defenses. They spoke in terms of imposing continuous pressure, of creating a beachhead that would deepen day by day until resistance lost coherence. The fleet suggested that the Allies now possessed the ability to replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them, to repair damage before it became crippling, and to adapt tactics without starving frontline formations of support. That realization was not triumphant. It was clarifying. The presence of so many specialized vessels forced a reconsideration of timelines. Previously, commanders had envisioned a fragile interval between landing and consolidation, a window when the operation would remain exposed. Now, confronted with hospital ships, repair tenders, floating workshops, and ships configured to unload directly over improvised piers, they recalculated. The window narrowed. They began to expect that engineering capacity, ammunition stocks, and armored reinforcement could arrive sooner and in greater proportion than in any previous amphibious undertaking. This recalibration of expectations was grounded not in optimism, but in systems analysis. Each ship, each manifest, each scheduled convoy represented a promise of continuity. The fleet also reframed the geography of the battle. The channel ceased to be a barrier and became, in their minds, an extension of the operation itself, a moving supply corridor under Allied control. With escort screens layered outward, with convoys timed in sequence, and with air cover assigned in overlapping zones, the generals saw that the decisive factor might not be the crossing, but the maintenance of throughput. Their thinking evolved accordingly. They emphasized port construction, traffic discipline on the beaches, and rapid clearance of obstacles to accelerate the flow inland. Expectations now centered on exploiting the ability to feed the fight faster than the enemy could react, turning logistics into an operational instrument rather than a constraint. Seeing the fleet concentrated in one vast formation also altered their understanding of commitment. This was not a probing action, nor a limited offensive designed to gain leverage for negotiation. It was a declaration expressed in steel and tonnage that the Allies intended to prosecute the campaign to its conclusion. The British generals grasped that once the fleet moved, reversal would not be feasible without strategic consequences that reached far beyond the battlefield. Expectations therefore expanded beyond tactical aims. They now viewed the operation as the opening phase of a sustained continental campaign, one that would require endurance, patience, and the steady conversion of maritime power into ground combat strength. At the same time, the sight of such concentration intensified their awareness of responsibility. Reframed expectations did not eliminate risk, they amplified the stakes. The generals understood that with resources of this magnitude, failure would be measured on a different scale. Decisions would carry national and coalition implications, and the margin for careless judgment had effectively disappeared. This recognition produced neither hesitation nor bravado. It produced sobriety. They expected the operation to succeed only if discipline, coordination, and restraint held firm across every echelon, from senior headquarters to the smallest landing craft. Gradually, as they continued to observe the fleet preparing, their conversations reflected a new calculus. The invasion was no longer imagined as a delicate gamble. It appeared instead as a deliberate transfer of industrial strength from one shore to another, orchestrated with precision and intended to be sustained. Expectations aligned with that vision. They anticipated setbacks, friction, and loss, but they also anticipated recovery, replacement, and cumulative advantage. In the quiet of planning rooms and along windswept observation points, the British generals came to see the Armada not as a symbol, but as a mechanism. And in recognizing what that mechanism could deliver, they adjusted their sense of what might be possible once the first orders were given and the fleet finally turned toward the coast.